The Senate chamber, a place built for solemn debate, cracked with something far uglier that day. Tommy Tuberville leaned back in his chair, lips curled, and let out a mocking laugh. It wasn't just a laugh. It was the kind that dripped with dismissal, the kind that told the room he didn't take Jasmine Crockett seriously. Not for a second. The sound lingered in the chamber like a taunt, bouncing against marble walls meant to honor history. Senators shifted uncomfortably. Staffers looked down at their papers. That laugh had crossed a line, but Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't rise to meet the noise. Instead, she lowered her gaze to the table before her, to the small folded letter resting beneath her hand. A letter written decades earlier, ink pressed by the weight of a soldier's heart. Her father's words are from Vietnam, the camera of the moment narrowed, the chamber's buzz blurring into silence. Crockett's fingers traced the edges of that worn paper, the same way her father once traced hope in a war-torn land. And in that pause, in that breath, the power dynamic shifted. The mockery of Tuberville's laugh suddenly seemed small, almost childish compared to the gravity of what Crockett now held. When arrogance laughed in the face of sacrifice, the narrator's voice seems to echo. No one expected a single piece of paper to silence the room. Tuberville smirked still, unaware. He thought his volume, his derision, was the final word. But across the chamber, eyes locked on Crockett, on her calm, unhurried hand lifting that folded letter. For the first time the air felt heavy, as if the weight of something bigger than politics was about to descend. It wasn't just a document. It wasn't just family history. It was a lived sacrifice, pressed into sentences that carried more truth than 100 Senate speeches. The kind of truth no laugh could erase, no arrogance could drown out. And as Jasmine Crockett slowly unfolded that letter, the chamber leaned forward, breath caught in collective suspense. Because in that instant, history itself seemed to rise. From the page, Tommy Tuberville's laugh wasn't new. It was his weapon of choice, the same tactic he'd used on countless opponents before. A quick, sharp burst of ridicule meant to shrink their words before they could grow wings. On cable news, in committee hearings, even in private exchanges, Tuberville thrived on mockery. He didn't counter with substance. He belittled, he smirked, he laughed. To him, humiliation was a tool. For years it worked. But Jasmine Crockett was not built to wilt under ridicule. Still, in the Senate's marble halls, she was marked as an outsider. She didn't come from a dynasty. She didn't carry the polish of establishment privilege. Her accent, her cadence, her unapologetic presence. To many of the old guard, she didn't fit. She wasn't supposed to last. Laughter was meant to remind her of exactly that. This is our chamber, not yours. That's what made this clash bigger than two senators trading words. It wasn't just about politics. It wasn't just about ideology. It was about something deeper, something raw. Respect. Respect for those who serve, for the families who bear the cost of war, for the sacrifices that build a nation. Laugh didn't just dismiss Crockett. It dismissed her father, dismissed the countless men and women who carried the burden of war, dismissed the bloodlines of sacrifice woven into America's story, and Crockett knew it. That's why she held the letter, not as a prop, not as a stunt, but as a piece of living history. Every crease in that paper carried her father's sweat, his fear, his hope. It was more than memory. It was proof. Proof that belonging in America is not decided by who sneers loudest in a Senate chamber. Proof that dignity earned in the jungles of Vietnam speaks louder than arrogance echoing off marble. The chamber understood it too. Even if they didn't yet know the words inside that folded page, a silence began to build, not out of politeness, but out of anticipation, because everyone could feel it. Something bigger was about to break through. Tuberville leaned back, certain his laugh had already won the exchange. But he hadn't noticed the shift. He hadn't seen how Crockett's calm presence, letter in hand, had already begun to reshape the moment. She wasn't merely defending herself, she was carrying a legacy. And that legacy was about to confront the Senate in a way ridicule could never erase. The stakes were no longer just Crockett versus Tuberville. They were about the measure of belonging in America itself, Who gets to claim respect? Who gets to define legitimacy? Who gets to belong? The chamber waited, and as Crockett's fingers brushed the folds of that fragile letter, the question burned hotter, because what she carried in her hands wasn't just a letter. It was a legacy. Tommy Tuberville did not rise through the world of policy or governance. He didn't build his name in law, or in service, or in community struggle. He came to power through the sidelines of football fields, where the roar of the crowd rewarded bravado, and where victories were measured in points, not principles. As a college football coach, Tuberville cultivated a persona built on confidence, swagger, and the absolute certainty that his voice carried the weight of authority. When he stepped into politics, he carried that same energy, the whistle replaced. With a Senate pin, the smirk intact. But here in the marble chamber, the stakes were different. Yet Tuberville leaned on the same habits: mock, diminish, laugh. To him, debate wasn't about listening, it was about dominating. He wasn't known for long policy speeches or for carefully reasoned arguments. He was known for derision, was known for laughing off opponents as though they were beneath him, as though their words were a nuisance, unworthy of real engagement. His laugh had become a political reflex, one that worked well against those who lacked the stamina to push back. That laugh carried echoes of a long history in American politics. The chamber itself has seen men who used ridicule as power, senators who sneered, who dismissed the voices of outsiders, who weaponized condescension as if it were statesmanship. It was the old playbook of intimidation, updated with Tuberville's Southern drawl and sideline swagger. His laughter was not innocent, it was calculated, a signal to allies and adversaries alike. You don't matter. I don't take you seriously, and neither should anyone else. And for a time, it worked. For years, Tuberville laughed off critiques. He laughed at calls for accountability. He laughed at the idea of being held to the same standards as others. His laugh became a shield, a mask that disguised his lack of substance by drowning out opposition. Smugness, not substance, was his strategy. But in that moment, facing Jasmine Crockett, something shifted. Tuberville thought he was playing the same game. He thought his chuckle, his dismissive grin, his arrogant tilt of the head would reduce her to another casualty of ridicule. He had no reason to believe otherwise, after all. It had worked before. He had watched seasoned politicians stumble. Under that kind of contempt, he had watched journalists falter, activists grow flustered, challengers shrink back. The laugh, for Tuberville, was more than a habit. It was his weapon of dominance. Yet what he failed to understand was the weight of what Crockett carried. To him, that folded letter in her hand was nothing more than a prop, something to wave dramatically before being swept aside. Did not see it for what it truly was, the living voice of sacrifice. The ink-stained testament of a soldier who had endured the jungles of Vietnam, a man who had bled for the very flag Tuberville claimed to defend, and so he laughed. He laughed not knowing what words slept inside that envelope. He laughed not knowing that the letter bore scars of war, that it carried a father's fear and resolve, that every line etched across that page was written under the shadow of death. He laughed blind to the history in Crockett's hands. Irony of it was sharp. The very laugh Tuberville believed would cement his dominance, would become his undoing. That laugh, so often his shield, would tonight turn into the loudest evidence of his arrogance. Because the truth of America's belonging, the dignity of sacrifice, and the unshakable reality of service cannot be mocked away. Tuberville thought this was another easy victory, another chance to smirk while the cameras rolled, another opportunity to reinforce his swaggering brand of politics. But arrogance has a way of blinding those who wield it. And in his blindness, Tuberville missed the obvious, the weight of the letter. The silence building in the chamber, the way Crockett's composure carried a power no laugh could diminish. His laugh had silenced many before, but tonight it would backfire, because Tuberville didn't know the letter he mocked was written in blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Jasmine Crockett did not step into the Senate chamber carrying privilege. She did not inherit power, nor was she handed the easy lanes of advancement that so often shield the already powerful. She came from Texas soil, hard-working class earth where bills had to be stretched, where opportunity was not assumed but fought for. Her story wasn't scripted for comfort, was forged in struggle. She grew up seeing her community ignored, dismissed, told they didn't matter. She saw friends lose chances before they even began, doors shut before knocks could be made. In that environment, Crockett learned that dignity wasn't something anyone gave you, it was something you held on to, no matter how many tried to strip it away. At the center of that lesson was her father, a Vietnam veteran. He had carried the weight of war long after he left the battlefield. His body bore scars, but so did his spirit. And yet from that pain, he gave his daughter the gift of purpose. He told her stories of jungles that swallowed men whole, of nights so dark the only light was the flicker of tracer fire, of comrades who never came home. But he also told her something more enduring, that service meant standing up even when the world told you to sit down. That belonging was not granted by the powerful, but earned through sacrifice, loyalty, and truth. To young Jasmine, her father's quiet strength was more profound than any sermon, more lasting than any textbook. His discipline, his endurance, his refusal to bow to the wounds life had carved into him, those were the lessons she carried. Her education came not just from books, not just from the classrooms where she excelled, but from a father who carried war in his scars and still chose to believe in a country that had often failed to believe in him. This duality shaped her. On one hand, she saw the hypocrisy of America, a nation that asked her father to fight, but often ignored the very people he fought for. On the other hand, she saw resilience, the insistence that dignity could not be stolen, not even by injustice, not even by laughter. This paradox gave Crockett her edge: empathy without naivety, toughness without cruelty, faith in justice tempered by the reality of struggle. When she pursued law, it was never for prestige. It was because she knew what it meant for voices to go unheard. She had watched her father stand in lines at veterans' clinics, and watched him navigate a system that treated his sacrifice like a footnote. She had seen neighbors denied fairness because they lacked the right last name, the right zip code, the right privilege. For her, law was not an abstract pursuit. It was a weapon, a shield, a way of giving dignity back to those who had been stripped of it. And so, when she arrived in politics, Crockett carried with her not just policies and talking points, but lived history. She was not a product of elite grooming. She was the product of survival, of grit, of inherited resilience. That gave her a clarity that Tuberville could never understand. Where his power had come easily from adoring crowds, from privileged pathways, hers had been won inch by inch, through doors slammed, through voices doubted, through constant reminders that she did not belong. It is this contrast that made their confrontation inevitable. Tuberville, the coach turned senator, mistaking arrogance for authority. Crockett, the daughter of a veteran, mistakes nothing. She knew that real authority came not from titles or smirks, but from truth lived in sacrifice honored. And that night, she stood in the chamber, holding her father's letter. She embodied the full weight of that legacy. She was not standing there alone. She was standing with the echoes of service, with the voices of those who had been dismissed, with the unbroken resilience of working-class families who carried this country forward without applause. Tuberville's laugh was the laugh of the privileged, the sound of someone who had never had to fight for belonging. Crockett's silence in that moment was the silence of the strong, the calm of someone who had already endured battles far tougher than a senator's mockery. Her father had once told her, "The war doesn't end when you leave the field. It follows you, and you decide whether to let it break you or define you." For Crockett, that meant carrying forward his resilience into every fight she faced. And tonight in this chamber, that war was not fought with bullets, but with dignity, not with screams, but with truth. As she held the letter, every word he had written decades earlier felt alive again. It was as though the past and present were colliding, as though the sacrifices of one generation were rising to defend the dignity of the next. The chamber did not yet know it, but the weight of that folded paper was heavier than any insult, sharper than any laugh, because this wasn't just about policy. It wasn't just about politics. It was about whether sacrifice still meant something in America, whether the blood shed in distant jungles would be honored or mocked away, whether belonging was defined by arrogance or by truth. And tonight, that voice would echo through her. The Senate chamber was tense. though it carried the false calm of routine debate. That calm cracked the moment Rand Paul leaned back in his chair, waving a sheaf of papers like a man dismissing an inconvenience. His smirk cut across the room like a knife, sharpened by condescension. He chuckled first, low, dismissive, then interrupted without warning. "There she goes again," scoffed, lifting the stack of documents high enough for the cameras to catch. "Another speech? Another dramatization. Maybe we ought to let her audition for Broadway instead of boring us with this nonsense." His laugh rippled, uninvited, across the chamber. A few heads turned toward him, some embarrassed, others entertained. The arrogance wasn't new. Paul had a habit of using mockery where arguments should be. He interrupted not because he had the stronger case, but because he wanted the moment to belong to him. His voice rose again, cutting off Crockett mid-thought. "You know, it's funny," he said, waving the papers again as though they carried the full weight of truth. "She parades around here talking about sacrifice and service, but where's the substance? Where's the belonging?" His words dripped with disdain, and the smirk returned like punctuation. A murmur ran through the chamber. Some senators shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward, sensing the drama unfolding. The audience gallery caught the tension, the growing contrast between Paul's volume and Crockett's stillness, because Crockett did not flinch. She did not scramble for a rebuttal or raise her voice to compete. She simply stood there, hands steady, the folded letter before her like an anchor. Her silence was louder than his mockery. Her composure made his words sound shrill, desperate, the laughter of a man who feared being forgotten. Paul, unsettled by her lack of reaction, pressed harder. He leaned across his desk, voice booming, hand gesturing wildly. "You don't belong here. You don't speak for America. You can't hide behind your little stories forever," his words echoed, bouncing against the chamber's marble walls. And still, Crockett didn't rise to his volume. She let the silence stretch, let his words hang like smoke that chokes the air but cannot last. The murmurs from the gallery grew louder. It was becoming clear his interruptions weren't breaking her, they were breaking him. Finally, Crockett lifted her eyes, locking them on Paul with a calm that seemed to drain the oxygen from the room. For a heartbeat, the chamber froze. Even Paul faltered, his voice catching slightly as if he realized the ground beneath him had shifted. The folded letter remained in her hand. Okay, but she hadn't unfolded it yet. That restraint, that patience, was power. She didn't need to fight for the stage. She owned it simply by refusing to play his game. And then came the moment. Crockett leaned forward, her voice steady, low, and sharp, cutting through his. "Bluster like a blade through glass. You've mistaken noise for strength," she said, her words deliberate, measured. But real power doesn't shout. Real power endures. The chamber fell silent. No murmurs, no laughter, only the heavy air of realization. Paul froze, his smirk evaporating as quickly as it had appeared. For the first time, he seemed small, diminished, undone, not by argument, but by dignity that refused to yield. And with one sharp line, Crockett stopped Paul cold. The silence was suffocating. For the first time all evening, Rand Paul had run out. Of noise, his hand, once waving papers triumphantly in the air, now hung awkwardly by his side. The smirk had slipped from his face. The room, the senators, the aides, the cameras, the public gallery, leaned forward as if pulled by gravity itself. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett struck. She lifted the folded letter just enough for the cameras to catch a glimpse of. Its weathered edges, her voice, low but unwavering, cut through the chamber. "Belonging isn't granted by volume," she began, each word deliberate, landing like a hammer against stone. "It's earned by truth, and truth is why I'm here." The effect was instant. Paul blinked, a flash of confusion breaking through his practiced bravado. He had expected a shouting match, expecting his interruptions to provoke a defensive scramble, but Crockett didn't shout. She didn't flinch. She spoke with the composure of someone carrying generations behind her. And that steadiness rattled him more than any raised voice could. Paul tried to interject, his lips parting too. Launch another sneer. But no words came. He faltered, swallowed by the momentum she had seized. His rhythm, the smug cadence of a man used to dominating debates, shattered in an instant. Crockett didn't pause to give him space. She pressed forward her tone, sharpening like a blade. You wave your papers. You mock. You shout. But none of that is true. None of that is service. My father wrote from the jungles of Vietnam while men like you were laughing on safe sidelines. His letter carried the weight of sacrifice. I carry it here in this chamber because sacrifice is what earns belonging. The gallery erupted. In murmurs, heads nodding, some even clapping softly before the gavel struck to restore order. Senators exchanged glances, some stunned. Others smiling faintly at the audacity of it. Paul shifted in his chair, gripping the desk as if bracing against a storm he hadn't seen coming. His usual armor, mockery, interruption, derision suddenly felt flimsy, paper-thin against the solidity of